Hello again. Alright, this video is going to be about empty names in Frege. By the way, sorry about the echo in the last few videos. Turns out my webcam has a microphone as well as the one I'm trying to use. Should be cleared up now. Let me know if they're too hard to hear and I can re-record if necessary. Okay, let's talk about empty names. What do I mean by an empty name? I mean something like a name that doesn't actually refer to anything. So one example that we're right about to run into in these pages I'll talk about is a fictional name like Odysseus. There was no such person. Um, Another example of a name that Frege uses later on, or maybe better to call it a description, is the least rapidly convergent series. This is a mathsy example. It doesn't matter for our purposes what's going on. I've told you in previous videos, Frege's at least as much a mathematician as he is a philosopher, so those are examples he's comfortable with. But here's an equivalent, something that does the same job for our purposes. The largest prime number. That's an example of an empty name, right? This is a perfectly legitimate looking expression of English. It's maybe even easyish to see how this has a sense, right? It's saying, look at the prime numbers. Those are the ones who can only be evenly divided by themselves and the number one. And then find the biggest one. But as you may be aware, there is no largest prime number. There are infinitely many prime numbers and they're unbounded. They keep going forever. So that means although this expression has a sense, it does not have a reference. So it's empty. It fails to actually pick anything out. Okay. Now, let's see what Frege says about empty names, because these are going to be important when we read, in particular, the Russell and Strawson papers that we're going to move on to after this, and the Donnellan. Okay, so I'm starting looking here at the bottom of page 156. He starts talking about, so in this bottom paragraph, remember he started talking about the sense and reference of an entire sentence, and he says, the sense expressed by a sentence is a thought. Now he says at the bottom here, what about the reference? Do we have a right to inquire about that? Is it possible that a sentence as a whole has only a sense but no reference? Okay. And he says, you might expect that there would be things like that, just as there are parts of sentences having a sense but no reference. For example, empty names. And he says sentences which contain proper names without reference will be of this kind. Of this kind meaning the sentence will have a sense but no reference, because a part of it has a sense but no reference. The that short Hyman Kratzer reading that I assigned you will give you some further resources that help explain why this is. So I told you they talk about compositionality, this principle that the meaning, the sense, the reference of a complex expression is determined by the meaning, the sense, the reference, respectively, of the parts and how they're put together. There's a bit more detail there about how Frege thinks compositionality works in language. He thinks all of the ways that parts get put together into complex wholes involves saturation and functional completion. That sounds confusing. Let me tell you what I mean by that. Okay, take take a sentence like this one. Odysseus was set ashore at Ithaca while sound asleep. This is going to be Frege's example sentence in just a second. Let's look for everything here that looks like a name, that looks like it refers to a person or a place or a thing, that kind of stuff. Okay. What I'm going to do now is delete those. Okay, I'm going to pull those out because those are parts that make sense by themselves. They don't have a gap that needs to be filled in order to have a meaning. So in Frege's terminology that he uses elsewhere, they're saturated. They don't need to be filled up to become what they're supposed to be. So we'll take out the name Odysseus, and we'll take out this other name. It's a name of a place rather than a person, but it's still a name, Ithaca. And I'm going to delete those from the sentence we started with. Okay. So we wind up with a picture where the original sentence comes from taking these three different parts and putting them together. So we have two saturated things, two things that are complete in themselves. They have a reference, they refer to a particular thing, at least if everything goes right. This one tries to refer to a person. This one succeeds in referring to, there is an actual place, Ithaca. There are now multiple places, Ithaca, but the one in Greece that Homer was talking about is in Greece. And what's left is this thing that has gaps. Blank was set ashore at blank while sound asleep. So Frege thinks this is another kind of part, right? Another kind of linguistic part. In particular, it's an unsaturated kind of linguistic part, linguistic expression. Unsaturated in that it's got these gaps. It wants to have names plugged into it in order for it to actually wind up saying something true or false. Okay. So Frege's idea is that the reference of an expression like this with gaps is going to be a function. That is something that says, if you put the name Odysseus in here and the name Ithaca in there, then you get a certain reference. If you put a different name over here and over here, then you get a different meaning. It's that association of all the possible names you could put in the gaps with the meanings that the sentence would have, the reference or the sense, depending. The association of input senses and references of the names you plug into those gaps with output senses and references of the sense as a whole. That's what this thing, this unsaturated, this gappy, incomplete thing, what its reference is. Now, Frege thinks, so for example, if I plug in some other name, so if I type in Roger was set ashore at Belfast while sound asleep, that's going to have as its sense the thought that Roger was set ashore at Belfast while sound asleep, whatever that thought is. And the reference is going to be false, because that never happened to me, that I remember. Okay. But then what happens if what I plug in there, if I put the name Odysseus and Ithaca, if I put those names back in, well, Ithaca, that has a sense, that's fine. It refers to a certain place, that works well. Odysseus has a sense, so we've got sense and sense there, so the sentence as a whole will express a thought, because that's the sense of a complete sentence. But the problem is, there is no such person as Odysseus. That sense associated with the name doesn't pick anybody out. So we still have a gap here if we're looking at the level of reference. We plug in the reference of the name Ithaca, so a certain island, I think it's an island, a place at any rate. And we plug in nothing over here. So Frege then thinks we wind up with something that still has gaps, so it still doesn't have a reference. It's neither true nor false. You've sort of plugged in nothing and you get nothing out. That's what Frege thinks happens with sentences that have names without reference. Referenceless names or empty names. You'll sometimes see in our translation here, remembering that they leave the word I'm reading as reference, they leave untranslated as Bedeutung. When Frege says that some name or expression is referenceless, it looks like this: Bedeutungslos. I don't actually speak German, but that's, if you run into that word, that's what it's saying, reference list. Okay. So, question. What happens to the sense and reference of a complete sentence that contains an empty name? Answer, the sense, totally normal. The reference, it has none. And remember, the reference of a complete sentence is its truth value. So Frege says, a sentence with an empty name, like Odysseus, is neither true nor false. Let me skip ahead a little bit and show you another thing he says that's relevant here. This will be relevant when we look at Russell and Strawson and Donnellan on sentences that have empty names. So here we are on page 162 now. Notice that Frege discusses sentences that have names in them. So a sentence like, where are we? Kepler died in misery. So Frege wants to say a sentence like this does not assert that there was such a person as Kepler. It does not assert that that name has a reference. Instead, it, here's a word I'm going to highlight, presupposes that. Okay, here's the argument. I'll leave you to read that. I want you to bear this in mind when we look at Russell and Strawson in a minute. Russell is going to deny this. Russell is going to say, in fact, when you have a sentence like Kepler died in misery, or maybe I should say instead something like the person who discovered the elliptic form of the planetary orbits died in misery. Russell's theory of how sentences like that works is going to have that sentence say there is a person who discovered the elliptic form of the planetary orbits, and there's only one such person, and that person died in misery. So on Russell's view, if it turns out that there is no person who discovered the elliptic form of the planetary orbits, which, if you like, we can shorten as Kepler. If it turns out that there is no such person, then this sentence would be, according to Russell, false. According to Frege, it would be neither true nor false. Okay. When we come on to Strawson, more or less replying to Russell in the 1950s, he'll say, without appeal to Frege, he'll say, no, this sentence just presupposes that there is such a person. And if there is no such person, then the sentence is neither true nor false. What does presupposition mean? We'll talk about that in a later video. But I want you to, what I want you to take from this one is what Frege's answer to that question is about what the reference of a sentence with empty names is, and some of his arguments for it. So one of them comes down here, page 162 and 163, and some of it comes earlier where he was talking about Odysseus. And I'll stop there.